Hey everybody, welcome to the Trainers Turning YouTube channel. My name is Mike, and in some of my older segmented bowl videos, I make mention of a segmented bowl tutorial, and I've had quite a few people asking me where they can find that tutorial. As I was re-uploading videos from my old channel to this channel, I decided that instead of just uploading that one, I was going to remake it because ever since I made that about 6 years ago, I've come up with new or better techniques on how to do things. So I wanted this to kind of have the latest and greatest information. So throughout this video, I'm going to talk about how I make my bowls. And in some cases, this differs from what other people do and say. And throughout the video, we'll kind of talk about the pros and cons and differences as far as how I do it versus other people. So this is going to be a 4-part series. Starting with part 1, we're going to talk about some of the design and math aspects of making a bowl. We're going to talk about cutting segments and then putting those segments together into a ring. In part 2, we'll talk about ring flattening. In part 3, we're going to talk about how we glue and clamp our rings together to form a blank. And then in part 4, we're going to talk about turning and finishing. So stay tuned and let's go ahead and talk about the bowl. So chances are, if you're watching this tutorial, you might be just starting out in segment bowl making. And that might mean that you really don't want to invest a lot of money into this hobby until you kind of know for sure that you like it. So a lot of the stuff we're going to be doing is very simple and basic and rudimentary. So to start out, let's go over our bowl design. There's a few different programs online that you can purchase that will help you design a bowl and tell you exactly what size your segments need to be and all kinds of things like that. Like I said, you have to purchase those, so chances are you might not want to yet. So when I design my bowls, this is just a little template I have made up in Paint, and I have one of these for a bunch of various different number of segment bowls. But what I'll do is print one of these off and then I'll just go ahead and highlight. So in the bowl we're going to be making today, the white part is going to be represented by cherry. The blue part is going to be represented by black walnut, and the yellow part will be purple heart. So, like I said, I've got this all drawn up already, and what I like to do is on the back, I just go ahead and write down what each ring consists of. So basically, our first ring, we're going to need 24 segments of cherry. On our second ring, we'll need 20 segments of cherry and 4 of black walnut. And basically that goes on, and you can just use this as a kind of cutting guide for what all you need to do. So if you're just starting out in segmenting, your first project might all just be of one wood or just something simple like this where it alternates. But what we do need to talk about is one of the traps that a lot of people fall into when they start segmented turning. And I see this all the time in different Facebook groups and other places on the internet where people are wondering why their joints fail and why their bowl falls apart. So we're going to talk a lot about joint alignment in part 3 of our video, but it's important that we lay a good groundwork for this in the design aspect. You'll notice that every one of these joints overlaps each other. And you can kind of think of this structurally like how they lay bricks. The seams of the bricks don't all line up, they overlap, and that gives us a lot of really good structure because when you have a super thin bowl, you really don't have that much glue in between here, but what we do have is all this surface area on the bottom that are joining these two together, and that's providing a lot of structure to our bowl. So unless you're specifically wanting something where everything's in a nice straight line, I would highly recommend that your segments offset by half. So we've got our bowl all designed, but now we need to figure out the angle in which we're going to cut our segments. And this is actually some fairly simple math. So what we need to do is take 360, because there's 360 in a circle, and we're going to divide that by the number of segments. So in our case, we've got 360 divided by 24 because we've got 24 segments per ring. So that gives us 15 degrees. Now, since there are 2 angles on each segment, we need to take that number and divide it by 2, which gives us a total of 7.5 degrees per cut. So if you want to further simplify this, instead of taking it 360 and then at the end dividing it by 2, just take your number of segments, which is 24 in our case, and then divide that by 180, which will give us, again, 7.5. So now we need to get everything set up to cut a 7.5 degree angle. So before we get cutting, let's actually talk about the segments themselves. So this is a segment which we will then glue together to form a ring and stack these to make a bowl. Now if we look at our segment, we have our two angled parts here that we cut and two parallel parts here. Now there seems to be some confusion online occasionally with how we actually go from this size ring to this size ring. And a lot of people think it has to do with the width of the wood we're using, but it does not. This upper part, which we're going to be cutting based off of, is always going to dictate how big our rings are. So the outside of our segment will always dictate the outside of our ring. So bigger ring means we need more length in our segment. Now if we use wider wood, say we use a piece like this versus a piece like this, that's going to make from here to here a lot bigger, which is going to in turn make the inner diameter of our ring a lot smaller. So this comes into play when we're doing the bottom of our bowl, really, because a trap a lot of people get sucked into is, say we just start cutting a segment and every time we just go up 1/8 inch. Our bowl is basically going to be a giant V. Now, if we want more of a bowl shaped, what we need to do is go out at different rates towards the bottom, and then as we get into our upper rings, then we'll want to start going more of a set distance. So in order to go out further with our cuts, we will need a thicker piece on the bottom. So now let's talk about knowing the size or the length of the segments we need to cut in order to get different size rings. Now there's a lot of really crazy math involved that I don't even know how to do. But there are a lot of places online that you can just type in your different dimensions, like your width of the strip, your angle, and length, and it'll tell you exactly what kind of ring is going to come out. I don't really use any of those. What I did when I first started segmenting was started making these charts. And basically I have one for just various different sizes, and this one is for 1.5 inch strip. This is going to be a 15 segment ring, so a 12-degree cut, and I basically will just go through and put what I cut it at and what the inside and outside diameter is. So I base a lot of my stuff off of that. Like I said, if you want to go use one of those Excel sheets while you're just starting out, that's perfectly fine too. So like I mentioned at the start of the video, this tutorial is going to show how I make my bowls. Now, this is the technique that differs from what a lot of people do. And again, we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons afterwards, but I like to use a miter saw to do this. A lot of people will tell you that you have to have a table saw with a wedgie sled, and that is just absolutely not true. I think this is great, especially if you're just starting out in segment turning or just in woodworking in general. I feel like a lot more people have a chop saw than they do a table saw. In my case, I do have a table saw, but it is too small to fit a wedgie sled on, and I just cannot justify the price of getting a new one just for that when I have this that works perfectly fine. So I'm going to show you guys how I set mine up to cut segments. Again, a lot of people on the internet will say that they're not accurate, it won't work. Well, all of the bowls that you saw at the beginning of the video, they had nice and clean joints, and those were all made with this technique. So we'll go ahead and I will show you how I do this. So when we talked about the design of the bowl we were doing and went ahead and did the math, we said that we needed a 7.5-degree angle to cut the segments. So we're gonna go ahead and just bump our compound in to 7.5 degrees and lock that down. Now, to set our length, I normally set up a stop, but before I do that, you can see on my saw, this is mainly all I use this saw for is segmenting. I've gone ahead and put little marks on the table itself, and that way when I set my stop up, I can just bump this back a notch each time depending on what I'm doing. So you'll notice that our stop is a triangle shape, and that's kind of important for this point right here. We want a nice clean point that's gonna sit in. We don't want anything interfering or giving us an inaccurate cut on the top. So that's why I go with this. So we'll go ahead and get this clamped in, and then we'll start making some segments. So our first ring, our segments are gonna be 1 inch, and that should give us just the right size ring for the 6.5 inch base we're gonna be using. So first thing we need to do is just clean up the end of this and put our 7.5-degree angle on that. So now what we need to do is flip this over because we always want the large end of our segment towards the saw. So another important thing to bring up as we flip our piece, obviously we're changing the angle of which side we're cutting on. So it's pretty important that we have two parallel sides here, because as we flip this, if this side here is even like 1 degree off from this or out of parallel, that's gonna cause us to have a different angle, and over the course of our 24 segments, that error could add up and give us quite the gap. So like I said, just wanna make sure that we have as parallel as sides as we can for when we're cutting based off the different sides. So now it's really important with this technique that after we make our cut, we let the saw come to a complete stop, because we have this small segment in here just kind of floating around. And if we were to pull the blade up while it's still spinning, one of those teeth could grab the very corner of this and throw it across the room. So just make sure you come to a complete stop. And that's kind of what makes this process a lot slower than using a wedgie sled. So we'll go ahead and just knock out the other 23 segments we need for our first ring. So while we go ahead and finish cutting our segments, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of the miter saw and a table saw with a wedgie sled. So cost and space are a lot less for a miter saw, and I feel like a lot more people have them. And that's really good for someone starting out in wood turning or woodworking, because they might not have the space or as much tooling as some of the other people have, and this is really great for that. What the table saw does have though is speed. As you can see here, this does kind of take a long time because we have to let the saw blade stop before we take our segment out. Where on the table saw with the sled, we can really just keep running those through at a pretty quick rate and they just fall away from the blade. Another advantage for the miter saw is the amount of angles we can cut on our compound. And this really comes into play if we want to make bowls with different numbers of segments, because each different number of segments is going to be a different angle cut. And on the wedgie sled, that means we need a different wedge for every angle we want to cut. So with the miter saw, we don't need any of that. So with the wedgie sled, there is some additional tooling just to kind of do that. But what that does mean is that there is a lot more accuracy with a wedgie sled. And basically you just need to set your two stops butted up against your wedge itself, which means it's really accurate and a lot more repeatable than, say, setting the compound on the miter saw, where you might have a little bit of error. So we've got the 24 segments for our first ring cut. I'm just going to go ahead and move our stop about 1/8 of an inch and make our segments a little bit bigger. And then we'll go ahead and just cut all the segments for the rest of our rings, and we'll go ahead and talk about gluing these up. All our segments are cut for all our different rings, so now what we need to do is just take a look at each of one of our segments and make sure that we don't have any really rough edges or any tear out. If we do, we want to just hit that with some sandpaper just to knock that tear out off, because if that does kind of get folded down, that'll mess up the fit between our segments and give us a gap. So thankfully we had a nice sharp saw blade and we don't have any of that, so we can go ahead and talk about gluing. So to glue our segments into rings, we're going to be using Titebond 3. The only difference between this and Titebond 2 is Titebond 2 is water resistant, where Titebond 3 is waterproof. So if you're doing something just artistic that's not going to get wet or anything, Titebond 2 works perfectly fine. I've used that for years. But if you're going to do something like a salad bowl that's going to have a more natural finish and possibly be submerged in water, I would go with the 3 because it's waterproof. So now we've got a piece of wax paper down. This is gonna just keep glue off our counter. It's gonna be a lot easier to clean up. And we also wanna make sure we have a nice flat part of our counter, because any little variance in these rings on the top, that's gonna be more we have to flatten when we get to part 2 of this video. So we're gonna go ahead and take our segments. We're gonna take a section of them and just lay them down like this on the side. Get some glue on them, and then we'll spread that glue. And now this is part of our ring that's going to have a pattern to it. So we'll get our black walnut, because that's going to be the differing wood in here. And we'll do the same thing with that. Now we'll just take a look over here, and we need 4 pieces of cherry and then 2 of black walnut. So we'll go ahead and just start laying these down and matching up the glue sides together. Now you might be looking and you see we have a lot of gaps and our circle is kind of all cattywampus. But now what we're going to do is take a hose clamp and just put this around the outside of it. Some people use rubber bands. I prefer hose clamps. You can go to a home improvement store and just get a contractor pack of these and then just put a few of them together if you need a bigger one, or get the smaller ones. Doesn't really matter. But we'll go ahead and just tighten this up and you'll see our circles start to come together. And as those segments move and we get tight, we want to just make sure any weird places like this, we kind of just push that towards the edge of the clamp, give it a little encouragement, and then our edge will start to come together. And then before we tighten that down all the way, we want to just push everything down, make sure our bottom is nice and flush, and then tighten it the rest of the way. So I'm gonna go ahead and glue up the rest of our rings. And then when these dry, you can join us for part 2 where we talk about flattening the rings. If you wanna see that part, then you can either check the link in the description below or check out the segmented tutorial playlist. Thanks for watching.